If you're a gamer, particularly a Nintendo gamer, there's a good chance you might recognize this guy. This is Masahiro Sakurai, one of the most revered game designers in the industry, and the lead creative force for one of Nintendo's biggest and most lucrative franchises, Super Smash Bros. And there's one particular game in that series that's going to be the focus of this video. Super Smash Bros. Melee. This was the second entry in the series, released as a launch title for the GameCube, widely held to be the pinnacle of the series in terms of gameplay. The game's physics engine allowed for lightning-fast and extremely technical combat. The gameplay was so deep that it created a major tournament scene, which is still thriving to this day, 14 years later. Super Smash Bros. Melee went on to sell more than 7 million units, becoming the top-selling title on the GameCube. You would think that with success like that, Sakurai, who was the director for Melee, would be beaming with pride for being responsible for such a creation, right? But you would be sadly mistaken. In fact, as shocking as it may seem, Sakurai views Melee as one of the biggest mistakes in his career, if not his entire life. Okay, fine. Maybe saying one of the biggest mistakes in his career is probably pushing it, but there's no doubt that Sakurai doesn't view the game in a very positive light. Now, I know some of you are going to immediately jump on me, pointing out how Sakurai said good things about Melee in the past. And that's completely true. Sakurai has given many interviews over the years where he's spoken very highly of the game. But that doesn't contradict the point that he views it as a disappointment. It's possible to have affection for something while also being ashamed of it. Think of it like a parent hoping their kid becomes a brilliant neurosurgeon, but decides to pursue a philosophy degree instead. Yes, the parent most likely still loves their offspring, but they probably won't be invited home for Christmas very often. And that's how Sakurai sees Smash Bros. Melee. Sure, it's one of his babies, but he's become deeply, deeply ashamed of it. Now, the fact that Sakurai thinks of Melee in such a fashion to begin with is bad enough, but what's really truly infuriating is why he feels that way. In order to understand that mentality, we need to take a trip back in time and see what exactly transpired. Back in 2003, shortly after developing the completely forgettable and poorly titled Kirby Air Ride, Sakurai decided to part ways with HAL Labs and Nintendo. The reason being was that he was tired of constantly developing sequels, feeling that his own creativity was being stifled. He left and soon formed his own company, Sora Unlimited. His separation from Nintendo, however, would be rather short-lived. Just 2 years later, at E3 2005, the late president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, shocked the gaming world by announcing that there was a new Smash Bros. In the works for Nintendo's new Wii console. This announcement surprised everyone, including Sakurai himself, who was one of the attendees sitting in the audience. Later that day, Iwata invited Sakurai for a personal meeting and asked him to head the new project, which technically didn't even begin production yet. After a bit of cajoling, Sakurai accepted Iwata's offer, and thus development for Super Smash Bros. Brawl would begin. And it was during these first few months where Sakurai would come to a frightening realization. It may sound crazy, but can you believe there was actually a time when we didn't have YouTube? The revolutionary video sharing service actually went live the same year that production on Brawl began. By the end of 2005, YouTube developed a massive user base, and all kinds of videos were being uploaded. One particularly popular set of videos were those involving high-level Smash Bros. Melee players. It was around this time that me and my friends discovered the tournament scene. We were absolutely amazed at the kinds of crazy things these highly skilled players were capable of. My friends and I played Melee all the time, but we were never this good. Tourney players were able to exploit the physics engine to perform moves like wave dashing, L canceling, and tons of other crazy tricks. It was absolutely fascinating. And like us and millions of other gamers around the world, Sakurai would come to discover this as well. Unfortunately, his reaction to this subset of Melee fans would be quite different than the reactions most of us had. When Sakurai finally came across these videos, he was completely and utterly horrified at what he saw, at what Smash Bros. Had become. While many of us Melee fans looked at such videos with admiration and excitement, Sakurai viewed them with disgust and contempt. In Sakurai's mind, high-level tournament play was an abomination, an affront to the natural order of Smash Bros., and it had to be destroyed. Sakurai vowed that such desecration would never be replicated on the next title. And so he immediately went to work and made significant and drastic modifications to the next game in the franchise, which would come to be known as Super Smash Bros. Brawl. With this game, Sakurai would quote-unquote fix every major mistake he saw with Melee. The game's physics were dramatically slowed down in comparison to not just Melee, but Smash Bros. 64 as well, and programming exploits like wave dashing and L canceling went the way of the dodo. But that wasn't enough. Sakurai seemed to go to comical lengths to make sure players would be unable to perform such feats ever again. And so he came up with arguably the worst gameplay mechanic ever to grace the series: tripping. Just as it sounds like, a character will, at various completely random times, just suddenly fall flat on their butts, leaving them completely helpless for a second or two. This concept served a dual purpose. According to Sakurai, he implemented this so that it would make things more chaotic and fun, what with it being totally random and all. The second reason seemed to be that this was Sakurai's way of making extra sure that if by some miracle a player was able to achieve wave dashing or some facsimile, the addition of tripping would make sure to nullify any usefulness that one would otherwise gain from it. As a result, the game wound up being a complete mess. Well, relatively speaking. While it was commercially successful, it wasn't as well received critically as previous Smash Bros. Titles. Fans immediately got to work on reconfiguring Brawl to fix Sakurai's terrible game design decisions, and thus came up with one of the most impressive efforts seen in the modding community: Project N. Sakurai no doubt disapproved. As I said in the beginning of the video, it's one thing for Sakurai to be disappointed with Melee. I mean, obviously I and millions of others would disagree with that outlook, but whatever. It's his opinion, right? I mean, even Shigeru Miyamoto at one point said that he was disappointed with Super Mario World. But the bigger issue here is why he feels disappointed with Melee. See, it would be totally understandable if, immediately after development was completed, Sakurai came out and expressed his displeasure at how the game turned out. But that's not what happened. For the first 4 or 5 years after Melee was released, Sakurai was quite proud of his achievement. I've read tons of interviews throughout the years, and up until development of Brawl began, I've never heard him say anything negative about Melee whatsoever. No, his animosity towards Melee only developed once he began working on Brawl. In other words, his antipathy for Melee seems to be completely retroactive. See, in Sakurai's mind, he sees Brawl as the zenith of the series. Brawl is how Smash Bros. Should have been from the start. Brawl is the true vision that Sakurai had for the franchise. And that's just mind-boggling to me. As mentioned earlier, Brawl plays completely differently from not only Melee, but Smash Bros. 64 as well. Both those games were much more speedy and precise than Brawl. After Sakurai completed Smash Bros. 64, an already tight and fast-paced game, he decided to make its sequel even faster. Then he comes out with Brawl, a game slower than molasses in winter. Are we to seriously believe that Sakurai, a man who is notorious for being a micromanager, a man who is an almost autocratic level of control over every aspect of his games, somehow wasn't able to tell the programmers to plug in some smaller numbers in the physics equations until he started working on Brawl? It took him 8 years to figure that out? Really? This is not a case of a visionary director that was hampered by technical constraints until very recently. This is a man who made a conscious decision to make the games the way he did. but now has decided for some reason that the way he made it in the past was a major mistake. Again, I don't care that he's vastly more proud of Brawl than Melee. That's his belief, and he can believe whatever he wants. But what vexes me is his bizarre rationale for feeling that way. Honestly, he reminds me a lot about how George Lucas now looks back on the original Star Wars trilogy with disdain and has contempt for his fans who didn't appreciate the brilliance of Jar Jar Binks. To Sakurai's credit, he did address some of these complaints fans had with the most recent title, Super Smash Bros. 4. He thankfully removed the unbelievably stupid tripping mechanic and made the game faster than Brawl. Sadly though, while Smash 4 is faster than Brawl, it's only marginally so. It's still much slower than Smash 64, let alone Melee. And for the people involved in the tourney scene, I don't think we'll ever see a Smash Bros. As fast as Melee ever again. Sakurai seems to have made it pretty clear that Smash 4 is as high as he's willing to go in terms of speed. And that in itself probably took months of cajoling from his staff and the Smash community to do so. Look, I admire and respect Sakurai as a game designer, and he's responsible for some of my all-time favorite games, but it seems pretty clear he's no longer a good fit for the series. It's quite apparent he carries a pretty big chip on his shoulders nowadays. Smash Bros. Melee is a burden that he will hold on to for the rest of his life. He's gone on the record saying that Smash 4 may be his last Smash Bros. Game as a director, and as much as it pains me to say it, honestly, it's probably for the best.